you all for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, 30 Minutes to Better Change Management Using ITIL and Agile. Before we get started, in addition to our thanks for having you all join us all, just wanted to let you all know that we will be recording this session, so if you are unable to catch the whole thing, or if you have others within your organization who may want to view this presentation, we will have this available on our website at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, if you have any questions during this 30-minute session, it is going to go fairly quickly, but we do have a Q&A option. So if you bring up the Q&A panel within the WebEx meeting, please feel free to submit any questions that you may have about change management, about Agile and ITIL, those frameworks and the practices surrounding Agile and ITIL. And certainly, if you have questions about how this relates to some of the tools that we use to enable these processes. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'll apologize up front. The 30 minutes that we're referring to here is the 30 minutes for this afternoon session. So it doesn't mean that it's going to take 30 minutes to implement this within your organizations. I know I've had some customers who have worked years on implementing change management. Within the ITIL processes, it's usually one of the first ones. Usually maybe incident problem might come first for an IT organization that is adopting ITIL practices, but change management is usually right up there, if not with incident and problem, then shortly thereafter. So to talk a little bit about the change management process itself, the goals are to enable changes that will benefit the organization, and also, while at the same time optimizing the risk. And you'll notice that unlike some people might think, it's not to prevent changes. We certainly do want to prevent disruptive changes, and we want things to be controlled. And it's also not to just minimize the risk. We want to optimize the risk, meaning that there may be some changes that are requested or that are required that may carry relatively high levels of risk, maybe 30%, say, for example. But if the benefit is 70% or the potential benefit is 70%, then in that case, we want to be making an informed decision to understand that the rewards may outweigh the risks in that situation. Another big thing or a big component of change management is the need for approval. So we want to be sure that people are responsible for the changes that they're making, that more people within the organization are either being consulted or informed. We set up workflows for approvals to make sure that all of the important stakeholders are being consulted, that they're having a chance to provide their assessment or approval, which can make this a little bit cumbersome. So there are certain things that we do to automate this process. We do want to make it accessible to everyone within the organization. So this last bullet here, we do want even customers to be able to request changes. So they should be able to request changes either to existing services, existing software within the organization, or even to request new software. Certainly, as part of IT organizations, you all understand when people kind of go rogue or bring their own devices or just make purchases without consulting IT, that can be very disruptive to the organization, especially if they expect IT then to support whatever's been purchased. So we want to have certain levels of authority conveyed on IT to be able to manage all of this and to manage it effectively and securely within the organization. So where does that leave us? I've talked a lot to this point about the ITIL side of it. You know, these are definitions taken from the ITIL framework. So now I want to introduce the Agile components. There are a lot of processes within ITIL, and there are 5 large volumes that cover all of these processes. So we have the 5 volumes, or the 5 phases of the service lifecycle. You can see change management is listed here. By contrast, though, the Agile Manifesto is very short. There's 4 bullet points here. This is the entirety of the Agile Manifesto. You can see it for yourself online at agilemanifesto.org. Unlike the 5 large volumes of the ITIL framework, this is all open source. It's free for anybody who would like to access it online. And as you can see, regarding the Agile Manifesto, it's focused primarily on development. So whereas ITIL is focused a lot on service support and delivery, Agile is focused more on, I would say, the delivery side and certainly the development side. So the second bullet point here, especially, you can see it talks about working software. Working software is more useful and welcome than just presenting documents to clients in meetings. What I would challenge here is that we could substitute processes for the word software in that bullet point. And what I think this points out is that we can use Agile itself to help streamline the processes that we're implementing within IT, even if those processes are part of the ITIL framework. So when we're looking at implementing change management within an organization, or if we are looking to improve it within our organization, we want to be sure that we are paying attention to the individuals involved. We want to have a working process. If you've ever done any reading or research within DevOps, if you've read the book, The Phoenix Project in particular, it's actually a fictional book, but it's based on DevOps, and it's actually a very entertaining read if you get a chance. When it talks about working processes, change management in particular in that book is very interesting to see how they've revised it, because it was known as a very cumbersome process within the organization, and their revision of the process, I don't want to ruin the surprise, but let's just say it involved a kind of a war room and lots of sticky notes. And that's how they got the process working and streamlined. So we want to focus on working processes regardless of what technology or tools we're using. We want to involve the customer. So we want to be collaborative. So if we are implementing an ITIL process like change management, we want to be sure that it's not just the managers making the decisions, but that people who are going to be involved in the process are involved in the process development as well. And then we want to be able to respond to change. So just like the goals of change management itself, we have to be responsive to changes within the organization. So if competition is picking up in our industry and we need to move more quickly, we've got to be able to update our processes potentially. If there are security concerns that have ramped up, or if there are additional regulations that are imposed on our company, then we have to be able to respond to that. And Agile methodologies help us to respond more quickly. There are also several principles related to and defined within Agile. You can see the list of 12 here. And again, I would substitute the word process for software. So we're focusing on some very basic things here. Customer satisfaction, welcoming change. So just like I defined in the first slide, whereas we want to enable positive changes, we want to enable and welcome changes. So again, another area where you can see parallels between the ITIL framework and Agile Principles. Another important word here is cooperation and communication. I think those two things are critical. I would argue communication is really key. If you're familiar at all with the ITIL framework, you'll know that it's, although it's how many years old now? It goes back to 1986, so it's 30 years old. In version 2 of ITIL, which I believe came out around the year 2000, really I liked version 2 because it focused a lot on communication and having a communication plan as part of any new or changed service within the organization. And I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about how important communication is and what different means of communication we have at our disposal. I won't read the rest of this word for word, but I will also, in addition to cooperation and communication, point out the word simplicity. We certainly like the tools that we work with. Of course, that's our job at RightStar, is to help our customers with these service management and service delivery tools. But we always want to provide guidance around best practices and simplicity. The benefit for us is that even though it may not take as long to implement, simple solutions are certainly easier to support and less likely to break. There are several methods that we have for implementing an Agile methodology or an Agile mindset within the organization. You may be familiar with some of these. I will talk about two of them, but understand that there are a number of different schools of thought when it comes to Agile. Again, this is not a proprietary framework. This is open and open for anybody's interpretation. But I'll start with Scrum. So I have gone through the Scrum training myself. If you have a spare few days, I would certainly encourage people to go and become a certified Scrum Master. It's really, it provides a lot of background and helps to, when you have to guide teams or projects, it can be there's a lot of interesting and critical information that you can glean from that training. Even if you don't become a Scrum Master or even if you don't manage development teams, there's lots of good information there. And we do at RightStar even conduct our projects in kind of an Agile hybrid, using an Agile hybrid methodology, certainly on the teams that I work with. Here's an example of the Scrum Lifecycle. So if you're working on a development project that uses this methodology or the Scrum methodology, you'll see that the work is broken down into what we call sprints. So instead of having a large group of requirements up front and then going away for a year and coming back and showing the customer, hey, look at this great stuff we built, and it perhaps maybe, presumably over the years time that it took to develop, their requirements probably changed. And maybe they didn't really understand what it was that they were asking for. By checking in, doing a review and retrospective every 2 weeks, you stay much more in touch with the customer. Again, there's that concept of cooperation and communication. So when you finally get to a point where you can release software, and again, you may do this iteratively rather than as a kind of a big bang type of implementation, you're going to hopefully be releasing software that is much more relevant, much more useful, and much closer to the actual requirements and needs of the customer. One of our partners is Atlassian, and we work considerably with the JIRA software. This is an example of a Kanban board from JIRA. And this is, again, Kanban is another one of the methodologies that are part of the Agile framework. So we can see here, and this goes back to the story that I was telling about from the Phoenix project and where they were using sticky notes. They had this, not in an automated format, but actually on a wall they had these various lanes, so starting with to do, in progress, code review, and done. And they actually had little sticky notes that would move from one phase to the next. So they could see where the bottlenecks were. Maybe there's a bottleneck in code review. If maybe you need to reallocate resources to have more people doing code testing. So it really helps teams to visualize the work that's being done. It helps to prioritize what gets done first. So maybe, especially on when you're using automation, you can bring those items that are most important to the top. And it provides more visibility, transparency, and better communication to everybody who's involved in the project. This word WIP here on the right, the flow of work. We're talking about work in progress. And again, that goes back to what I was saying about being able to identify bottlenecks and really providing for, at any time, people should be able to put additional items in the to-do list. So they should be able to add additional requirements there. And again, since you're breaking them down into to small requirements as opposed to a very large requirements document, those small requirements may be called user stories. That's an Agile term from the Agile framework. Since you're breaking things down into such small pieces, you're breaking these tasks down, it allows for more continuous integration and deployment. So going back to change management, so we have this environment, if we've deployed Agile, whereby we've got a lot of changes happening on a much more frequent basis. When we normally think about change management, there's kind of this, the normal change or a typical change would be a large rollout or a large release. What I would argue is that for when you're using Agile, you should be pushing down the levels of authority. So I'm going to skip a few slides ahead here. This is one of my favorite things, and when you've worked with ITIL as long as I have, I guess it's maybe seems silly, but I do have some favorite ideas from the ITIL documentation. But there's this concept here where you have, with higher levels of risk, come higher levels of approval. Lower levels of risk, of course, push down the level of approval. What we're really aiming for when we have established processes like Agile that allow for a more regular and iterative review and verification and testing before software is rolled out. And if these are small changes, they have relatively low impact compared to a large change, then you really have a situation where you can put the Scrum or Scrum group or the Kanban process within this local level of authorization. So you're really pushing down the level of approval because we are identifying these changes as low risk. We want the communication. We do still want there to be good communication, escalation if needed, if there's additional risk that's perceived, and then decisions and actions can be communicated down from the board of directors down to the local team. So what we mean by local authorization is just the actual team who is working on the change. So there are a number of forms of communication. So again, we're talking about, we have communication not just within the team, but also between different levels of authority. And I think that the key thing here is that an ideal way to communicate to the organization regarding changes is to use something that's simple. It allows for ease of cooperation between teams and individuals, and provides immediate communication. So we can see here at a glance where we are in the project, what's being reviewed, and what's been finished. So for most organizations, you already may have a change management process in place. Again, you may have grumbling or complaints that it's perhaps too cumbersome. There may be need for improvement to the change management process, especially if you feel that people are trying to circumvent the process and in turn escalating the risk, or elevating the risk and elevating the damage that could potentially be done to the organization. So I'm going back to ITIL here for this concept of continual service improvement. It's the 5th phase of the service lifecycle. It's focused on identifying and introducing improvements. And the Deming Cycle is really the core or the basis of the continual service improvement model. The Deming Cycle is simply this: plan, do, check, act. It was named for the gentleman who came up with this idea. Very simple, but it's very core to what we do within CSI, and this is how it plays out within continual service improvement. What's the vision? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? Did we get there? And how do we keep the momentum going? And again, the Deming Cycle, although it is the key to the ITIL framework, continual service improvement model, it's also very important as part of Agile. It's this whole idea of the Scrum, where you're going through each sprint. So each sprint can be seen as its own cycle of improvement. So we may have some new requirements, or we may even have revisions of previous requirements. And we go through that on a 2-week cycle. There is certainly within the sprint or the Scrum lifecycle, there are stopping points for review and for taking corrective action, just like in the Deming Cycle. I do want to leave a few minutes here for question and answer. I see that we have had some questions come in. So I hope this has made sense to everyone. Certainly we'd be happy to talk to you all in more depth about this. But really the key here in talking about change management, talking about the importance of cooperation, communication, and of this continual service improvement, I do want to point out that although these methodologies are very different, it's not Agile versus ITIL in this case. We can use the teachings of Agile methodologies to help us streamline the implementation of ITIL processes. Both methodologies embrace the Deming Cycle and this iterative approach. The Agile approach is ideal to go hand in hand with ITIL ITSM, and as I said initially, it can help to simplify the processes themselves. So I'm going to take a moment for questions and answers. Let's see here. Let's see if I can get this extended so I can see. I'm trying to think of how to revise this question a little bit. So there's a question about, if we about levels of approval. So if you have, the question is, you have people further up in the organization who are demanding that there are more rigorous approvals and sometimes multiple levels of approvals before changes can be made. How do you go about changing the approval levels or convincing them that, to take a more agile approach? I think that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. It really depends on the culture of the organization. But I would say through education, educating people about not just the ITIL framework, which can demand a lot of these approvals and may be perhaps interpreted incorrectly to bolster people's need for a little bit more cumbersome process. But I think that DevOps certainly has gained traction within the last few years. There's lots of good materials out there. And I would say that there are other arguments besides just mine as to how Agile and ITIL can work together to really streamline the processes within the organization. And automation can help there as well. So anything you can do to automate processes. We've gone into some organizations where they've had these long Microsoft Word checklists or forms, and we've been able to take those and really put those into a more automated form, even having things like approvals provided via email or a little checkbox instead of, especially if the people who are making the approval decisions aren't regular users of your service management or service delivery tools. I believe that was all then for the questions. Oh, wait a minute, one other question did come in. How do you reconcile the need for documentation while using an Agile approach? How do you satisfy audits? That's a good question. And we've had that come up before. And I think the key thing there is audits. And if you're having, if you have audits or regulations that require you to do documentation, that question may take a little bit longer for me to think about and answer. But I know for in our organization, we honestly do a lot of screenshots, and also just the change requests themselves. So if you have a change, to show that you are getting approval on the changes, that certainly is helpful for audits. Regarding the actual software development, there are tools out there that will help to streamline the documentation, and we can certainly talk to you all about those if you're interested. Yeah, especially there is a follow-up question about specifically financial audits. And usually financial audits are more concerned about the approvals and seeing that that people don't have access to information they shouldn't have access to, and that there are appropriate levels of security on the data that's being handled. So yeah, I mean, I think even with the kind of the Kanban, if you saw the work in progress, that is still a form of documentation. You can see where the requirements were, you can get a verification that testing was done, and you can get a verification of what the solution was, or what the fix or the new solution was that was built.